It is time once again for Natural 2, our unscripted D&D and tabletop talk show. This time we are going to use our proficiency in running our mouths to talk about skill checks, mostly from the perspective of being a DM and how to adjudicate skill checks. Um, I want to do things backwards today and start by talking about some specific cases, and then we'll do kind of a general discussion of the stray thoughts that have occurred to us as we were untying those specific knots.
All right.
So I don't think that it's uncommon for people to wonder about what skills and stats apply to what problems in the game. And the most common one that I think I have seen that I want to start with is the deduction triad. That's what I've just this second decided to call it. And that is perception versus insight versus investigation.
Okay.
So, if you would like to start us out.
So I think the best way for me to kind of make mental rulings on things as a DM is I place a hypothetical party in a hypothetical situation. And most often the situation that most players run into is they enter a room or enter a dungeon chamber, something of that sort. And then in my mind, I then break down what the party might be interested in and what that might look like. So perception is probably the thing that most people rely on, probably the skill that probably gets more use than it should. It's probably a bit more of a blanket than it ultimately should be. But as far as my awareness of it, because I'm not reading the definition of it from the rulebook, is it as things that you are actively able to perceive, this being sight and smell and hearing and things of that nature. So if you walk into a room and you're asking, what does it look like? Or, what's the general vibe? Or what is the environment that we are about to deal with? That would fall under perception as far as I'm aware. What the texture of the walls are, what like the vegetation is like, or what it looks like. I guess a quick segue is if they start asking for, I guess, identifying things or things that require more knowledge versus just looking at something, right? Like, I see plant is green and red. What do those specific markings mean? That then goes beyond what perception is, because then you would rely on someone who has vast knowledge on the vegetation of this dungeon or this environment. So that's kind of where I would begin and end perception is what do you see, what do you hear, what are the kind of hints that the party get, which then they can act upon with different skills, whether that's investigation or insight. Did you want to throw in your little pitch or you want to go through the whole roster?
No, go through all of it.
Okay. So after giving the party those hints with perception, it then kind of becomes, I guess, a toss-up between insight and investigation. The way that I usually use insight when it's not a social encounter, and this is, I guess, a whole part of that conversation that perhaps we'll get to, is insight is like your natural way of deducting things as far as I kind of formulated in my mind. So if you see a bunch of like obvious clues, but perhaps it's not obvious to the player or the character, depending on how, I guess, immersed or how non-meta you're getting, that would be an insight check roll, or that would be what I would use as a DM to give more hints, is if you did do an insight roll, I, as the DM, knowing the situation and all the various aspects of what is going on, would use that to then hint on clues that insight would reveal. And then as far as investigation, I usually picture that or use that as I am physically looking through things. I am moving things, looking under things, searching through things. I'm trying to find more physical clues or expose things that aren't based on perception. And so that could be finding something under a rug. Would not be perception. Maybe you could begin the breadcrumb trail if you walk into the room. You perceive that the moss on the floor is disturbed around the rug. That isn't an investigation check, but it allows either the party to go, hey, I'll go flip the rug over, or they're like, oh, that's suspicious. I'm going to do a general investigation check. And then you reveal, hey, when you flip open the rug, trap door. And so that is kind of, I guess, the dividing lines that I use in this example. But of course, it gets more blurry based on, I guess, more fine or precise examples. But yeah, I guess that's my little first brief explanation of everything.
I agree for the most part. I think that you and I differ on where to put the line between perception and investigation.
Hmm.
I think of perception. Perception is the top of a very short tree, and insight and investigation sort of branch out from perception. And I think of perception as being uh, how you find or perceive things that you are not yet aware of as being there.
Hmm.
Um, so perception is how you, of course, notice if someone is sneaking up on you or is hidden in the space, but it's also how you find something that you don't already know where it is. So for me, finding something under that rug would be perception still,
Hmm.
and searching bodies is perception. Um, Generally speaking, again, the lines do blur somewhat in some cases, but insight, just to get it out of the way, I think of as how well do you pick up on nonverbal communication? How well do you detect? I was going to say perceive, but I want to avoid that. You can't use the words in the definition.
Hmm.
How well do you detect the things that someone is unknowingly communicating? Um, is I think a good way of thinking about insight. If you just wanted to see if somebody had a scar in a particular place, or if what the details of the signet ring were that they were wearing, I would put that under perception.
Hmm.
Um, and investigation, I can't take credit for this. It was something I saw someone else say on a Discord channel a long time ago. So it's not mine to take credit for, but I really love this explanation. Investigation is insight for objects and
Hmm.
what the object can tell you, or what you can learn from it more than where is it. So you would use perception to find the hidden ledger that the crooked mayor keeps in his office, and then you would use investigation to page through that ledger and see what details you could connect from it. Um, and this seems like an appropriate place to add that uh, investigation, perception, and insight are the three we go to for detection. But I also try to remember to be open to other skills that can accomplish something similar but with a different flavor. So you might investigate a dead body to find the fatal wound, or you might do a medicine check to determine how this person died or when. Um, but that's just as an aside. If you find that you're leaning on perception and investigation a lot, look for opportunities to work some of those other skills in a similar way. Give people who have proficiency in medicine a bone.
No, I certainly agree with that last part. You can lean a lot more on people's like fringe skills, or at least like the non-core skills that everybody uses. Of it could even just be like a religious check. If you walk into a temple room and you see one of the figures isn't lined up the way that it should to, you know, do the proper religious prayer of that day. Like that's a really easy way of including something that you could have done perception or investigation for, but now relies on a character's ability. I think I would fight you pretty adamantly against your, I guess, difference between perception and investigation. Because if perception is being able to find hidden things that are otherwise not available to your senses, because like as far as I imagine, like a perception check is you are leaning into your senses trying to get more hints or clues or information. Investigation is when you are actively taking another skill, this skill being knowing generally where to look or knowing how someone thinks or, being able to focus your attention on things that are out of place. So if you remove that from investigation and then instead put it on perception, I think that is giving perception way more weight than it is, because again, this is down to our opinions. That's totally fine. I guess I'll throw out here, however you rule it at your table, go for it. But I think as far as like trying to keep things clear and also keep things relatively balanced, you would want perception to stop at perceivable things. You do use it to find things, but you don't use it to find things behind corners or under rocks or in the other room. I mean, you could hear them, but you're not finding them. And that's where I think investigation or physically moving your character also sometimes makes investigation redundant. But that's where I think investigation steps up. And when that becomes the more reliable check or skill check versus perception, like, oh, I do a perception check and now I know that that book over there is something like, again, I would use perception as a seed of like, all the other books have dust, but not that one. And then an investigation check would maybe reveal the same thing, but with different flavor. As I guess is trying me to explain myself.
I think that our lines on that are close together,
Mm-hmm.
even if they're not in exactly the same place. Another example that comes to my mind is perception tells you where the secret door is. Whether it be, you felt a draft over here or the
Mm-hmm.
stones are uneven, whatever. Investigation is how you might figure out how to open it.
Okay, I think what I was getting hung up on is, I guess, your terminology of where it is was me thinking like that was the solution. But you're just saying you now know the physical location of this, not like what it is and how to do it.
You know that it exists,
Okay,
and now investigation is more of what good does that do me? What
gotcha.
what knowledge do I gain by now having this uh in my perception?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, to circle back around, and this is going to be hell on earth to try and make the topic cards actually topical. Um, I love the recommendation or the advice of trying to incorporate more skills in less, I guess, like generic or stereotypical ways. Like stealth does not just have to be used to roll your stealth check to move silently. It could be trying to assist someone else in doing it, or trying to see if the local thief is worth anything because you yourself are a master of stealth and just watching him move. How does that look to you? You can tell a lot by that if you are a man proficient in stealth. So that's a lot of cool stuff you can do there that is not used all that often.
And I think this is a good time to say be open, whether you're DM or player, to either listening to or making the case for an alternative use or an alternative combination
Hmm.
even. It's mentioned, I believe, in the player's handbook, but I hardly ever see it done, is even though athletics is defined as falling under strength, um, this is a bad example. Let me switch. Intimidation is defined as falling under charisma, but it's not hard to imagine a strength-based intimidation attempt
Hmm.
or a an intelligence-based intimidation attempt. I can come up with that,
Hmm.
scenario. Uh, so in either case, don't don't overlook opportunities to be a little modular or a little flexible with how those work. I think that can help cover some edge cases that would otherwise seem clunky or wrong, such as the huge barbarian who has a charisma of 8 not being able to frighten anybody.
Hmm.
He's naturally frightening, even if
Hmm.
his charisma is for shit. So, excuse me, even if his charisma is for crap. Family show.
Uh-huh, yeah.
Um, anyway, you get the point.
So I have a question for you, sir.
Go ahead.
What is your ruling, or I guess your opinion, on players in DMs and when they call for checks? Do you think the players should take the initiative of I walk into room and I want to do a perception check? Or do you think they should walk into the room and say, I want to look around, and then the DM asks for the perception check? Do you think it should be one way or the other? Do you think it should be a mix? What are your opinions?
I think that in the first place, check with your DM. Don't do
Hmm.
something that they specifically hate.
Hmm.
You need to ask first because I have seen people who feel that players volunteering checks or rolling checks that haven't been asked for is potentially disruptive. Um, so find out what your DM's preference is. My preference is that, especially if it's a group like ours where we all kind of know what each other is about at this point, that players can absolutely say, like, hey, can I make a perception check, or I'm gonna go on and roll intimidation before I make this big speech and make myself look stupid with a low roll. I like that just fine.
Hmm.
And if I feel like it doesn't fit, then I can just say so and say,
Hmm.
act, or if even if it's not necessary, if someone walks into a room and they say, I want to make a perception check, and I might just tell them, you don't really need one. This room is empty. Or the thing that's important is just sitting on a pedestal in the middle.
Hmm.
Um, so I have no problem with that. In your game, find out whether your DM has a problem with it first, particularly if you're in one of those groups where the DM isn't going to stop you if they do have a problem, and they're just going to go on Reddit and say, my player won't stop doing his own checks and it's driving me nuts. And then all the people on Reddit say, well, you need to talk to him.
Hmm. My case for it, if you are a DM who finds that irritating, or if you're a player who feels like that's overstepping or that's the DM's job, this would be my argument for it. So often, especially with newer groups or groups that are less familiar with each other for whatever reason, there is a gap in communication or intention. A player will walk into a room and say, hey, I want to do a quick look around. And sometimes the DM is juggling a whole array of plates and they go, oh, you see this and that and this and etc. Where the player really wanted to roll a perception check and see what that came up with and use that ability. Maybe they were building it up or had some sort of bonus or something they were looking to take the advantage on, and then was like, oh, okay, I guess I just won't roll perception. He's already had the description. We'll just keep moving on. And so I don't think this is like a prevalent problem that every table has, but I could see that occurring every so often. So if you really are looking to do something specific, and this is also kind of speaking to the topic of using other skills besides the core skills, because at least for me as a DM, when I'm trying to come up with what skill applies, there is a short list that I think of that I rely on. I don't look down the whole skill tree every time to try and figure out what cool thing I might be able to do. So if you as a player go, you know, I grew up in this, or, my family owned this or something, instead of using an investigation check, I use a history check or something of that sort. And I imagine most DMs, if you do the appropriate legwork, would be like, yeah, that's actually a really good thing and adds to the story, which is the whole point, I suppose. So that would be my argument for it, is it closes that gap where there's kind of a misstep in intention and communication, and it adds to the flavor because the player is bringing their opinion and their character and their side of the game forward without having to rely on the DM asking them a specific question.
The only thing I would add is to know, to have a reasoning and be ready to say what it is, other
Mm.
than that number is bigger.
Yeah, and don't argue it is another thing I should tack on. Is like, don't drag the game down by like, oh, but this person was able to do this skill check last session, and like, not worth it. Just let it go if that comes up.
That that could be its own episode, except we can cover the whole topic in 2 seconds right now. Nobody ever won a game by arguing with the ref,
Hmm.
as far as I know. If you're a sports fanatic that knows of an edge case back in 1947, just keep it to yourself. But uh, there's no point in doing that. So just be a good sport and say okay and move on.
Yeah.
Speaking of sports, the next specific case is athletics versus acrobatics.
I honestly hate this, to be honest. Like, as a DM, this plagues my mind more often than it should. But do you have an opinion, sir?
So I think that the foundation can be found in the player's handbook, where it describes athletics as being running, climbing, and jumping, and acrobatics as being fancy footwork to get yourself out of a sticky situation. And I
Hmm.
think the problem that people run into is that when they hear acrobatics, they think of that as being jumping
Like gymnastics almost.
and gymnastics, yeah. But in general, those things are covered by more of those things are covered by athletics, and acrobatics, rather than being gymnastics, is more like um how sure-footed you are, or how tricky you are.
So,
um
to kind of like really quickly put this problem in front of you, the issue that I always have is athletics incorporates this huge amount of like adventuring problems that adventurers run into, and then dexterity saving throws cover a lot of what acrobatics probably would be if dex saving throws weren't a thing. And so I find it incredibly difficult to find a situation where acrobatics is called for, where it isn't a dex save and it isn't an athletics check.
so this was actually the next topic that I had in mind, but we'll go ahead and skip to it ahead a little bit.
Mhm.
Saves versus skill checks. Saves are the rule of thumb for me, in my mind, without referring to the book or picking apart the verbiage. Saves are what you do when something happens to you,
Mhm.
and a skill check is what you do when you're attempting to do something.
Mhm.
If you are being offensive or affirmative or active, you are using a skill. If you are being reactive or defensive or trying to respond to something that is about to happen to you, that's a save.
Mhm.
So if someone says, I want to go across this tightrope, which is an example in the player's handbook, that's acrobatics. If they fail their acrobatics check halfway across the rope and now they're about to fall, it's a dex save to grab the rope and avoid plummeting into the spikes.
Mhm. No, I think we are perfectly lined up there. That is about how I would explain it all.
So that to me, that's an easy way to remember. Is it something that they have asked me if they can do it? Skill. If
Mhm.
it's something I'm telling them that they have to try to avoid, save. No one should ever be volunteering a save,
Well, I
basically.
think that's the key word is avoid. Like there are times where a skill check is called upon for a reaction, like I am attempting to move something or I'm fighting a boulder rolling down a hill. I guess that would actually still kind of qualify as a strength save in some scenarios. But there's also times where it's like, oh, it's really tough and you really got to power through. Give me an athletics because you are relying on your skill for athletics. I guess I don't know if you were planning on going through this, but the difference between calling for a check or a save versus relying on skills, I think the one that I usually have the most, not difficulty with, but just kind of like disinterest in trying to figure out on the fly is like when a strength check is called for, when an athletics check is called for, when a strength save is called for. Those get really murky with a lot of situations.
I think to simplify my rule of thumb even more is it expected or unexpected?
Hmm.
Falling off the rope uh, was not necessarily expected, or it
Hmm.
wasn't part of the plan.
Hmm.
So now it's a save. But if it's something that they are, knew all along was going to be the case, or something they're trying to accomplish, that falls more under the skill check category
Hmm.
for me. Um, Also, while we're on the subject, uh, instead of doing the mop up at the end, we're doing it in between, but that's okay. Um, straight stat versus skill. The book does refer to strength checks and dex checks and wisdom checks versus specific skill checks. I tend to think that you really should be trying to call for skills more
Mhm.
often than not. And if something really just seems to be an in-between case, then the stat, but not the other way around. Don't
Mhm.
lean too much on calling for stat checks without the skills,
Mhm.
because then you're robbing the person who built their character and invested in that proficiency. Um, and if they're not proficient, then the skill check you ask for is a straight stat anyway.
Yeah.
Um, so you're not losing anything by doing that. Just try to remember to call for a skill, because you don't want someone to be proficient in athletics, but now you're telling them just to roll strength, and you've basically penalized them a -3 or whatever on their roll before it's even begun.
I think one of the stats that this I would almost argue that this is something you should rely on more often, but it's more just like an idea or a thought, or at least something to kind of consider, is with charisma. You have your persuasion, you have intimidation, you have deception, and then insight's wisdom, but that sometimes comes into the play of a social encounter or an intent behind something, right? So you can always call upon like every single skill, but I find that somewhat in some cases. So I very rarely, but I do use this as a tool if the party is trying to do something as a group, or if a player is trying to do a lot of different kind of complicated things in one action or one kind of push. I'll just ask for a general charisma check, which kind of encompasses like the beginning of their sentence was intimidation, but in the end of it was persuasion, and then in the middle of it they were trying to deceive. And like when it becomes so complicated and also a lot of like perspective or opinions, like the player might think they're deceiving, but the DM might, or vice versa. And so that's when I would kind of be like, hey, give them the benefit of the doubt, maybe lower the DC or give them advantage, whatever you want to like trade to make it right. But I would, at that point, use charisma straight as a role, so you're not trying to juggle all of these other complicated things, because it's already going to be a little bit strange. That would be my kind of little sub option to kind of use occasionally.
While we're on the subject, group skill checks. You just use that example for charisma.
Hmm.
Um, the the way the book handles it, and the way that I tend to agree or default to, is that if you're making a group check, everybody rolls, and as long as half of the people beat the DC, then the whole group succeeds.
Hmm.
And I think that you have done it as an average in the past,
Hmm.
but unless I need to go back to math class, you're just making more work for yourself, because that's the same thing as more than half the group succeeded. That would put the average over the DC.
The only time that I find actually getting an average useful is when I use a skill check as an opposing DC for the adversary. So, like, if you guys as a group are trying to persuade someone, or you guys as a group are trying to stealth past somebody, instead of saying, oh, yeah, the first guy succeeds with flying colors and the second one succeeds, I'll just let the group succeed, which is totally fine way of running it. I find it more interesting, or at least a bit more thematically connected in my mind, that yeah, the person who was just miles ahead of the group with this ability is kind of giving some of that skill to the rest of the group. So you collect an average, and then you have, a perception check from the enemy to try and see through their stealth, or an insight check to see through their deception, whatever it might be. That's the time that I enjoy using an average, because it gives me like an actual thing to hit. It gives the enemies a chance to like have some sway or some interaction, versus like, all right, as long as two of you, which more than likely probably three of you are already proficient with the skill or have some reason to succeed this role rather easily, now it actually is like a, oh, someone did really well and that matters, versus a binary, oh, I succeeded and oh, I failed, but two of us succeed, so we win. That would be the time that I use it. And it does slow things down. I have to sit there and find out the average, but I find that more interesting in certain scenarios.
I I do like it as a refuge for the party. I think the most common group check is a stealth check,
Hmm.
and I like that as a way to keep options open for the group, even though one character may not be built for that.
Hmm.
Um, I there's been a lot of comedy, scare quotes, derived from the fighter in heavy armor is making noise again, clank clank clank, ha ha
Hmm.
ha. Like, yeah, okay, we've been making that joke for 25 years. Um,
But
I
doesn't it
like
make you laugh every single time?
oh, and the entire time for hours, just one long 2 hour laugh. No, I really like the group check in that situation as a way to let the party be clever and creative and not close something off or split the party potentially, because that one guy is just never going to make that role.
Hmm.
So don't forget the group checks. I've seen in a lot of situations, like a lot of actual play, because that's everywhere now, that the DM is not they're not calling for for group checks, and it's leading to half an hour of that exact thing. Oh, the heavy armor guy, clank clank clank. Like, okay, yeah. I mean, you might have a reason why you don't want to do a group check every time, but just don't forget about it, is what I
Hmm.
would say. Anything else before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, this might be genuinely a whole kind of video topic, and we say that often, but perhaps we can cover it briefly. Helps and assistance on checks. I think that it is used way too broadly. I would like to see it a bit more restrained, or I think it might, like it was intended to be restrained, and it kind of has just kind of gotten a little bit out of control. But that is one reason that group checks usually don't happen because the party is so in the mindset of like, oh, someone failed, oh, I help, oh, I help, oh, I help, and then everyone rushes over, and then it's just nothing anymore.
I think that people, the players overuse help, and DMs overcomplicate help.
Hmm.
There again, I've seen in some actual play examples that somebody says I'm going to help, and they make that person roll and see if they can beat a DC, and
Hmm.
whether or not they succeed determines whether or not they can help and give the other person advantage. No, 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 no. It's they don't. The helping person doesn't roll anything.
Hmm.
Rules as written. So put that out of your mind first of all. Secondly, I think that help should only apply if it's something you can try again. So in the situation you were just describing where, oh, they failed, I help, I help, I help. If it's like a trap disarm or something like that, no,
Hmm.
you didn't. You don't
Hmm.
help. The trap goes off.
Hmm.
No retroactive helping. It's a
Yeah.
new attempt in that case. So whatever the consequences were going to be, those happen.
Hmm.
Um, and the third thing about helping that I would really shine a light on and say to remember is that a character should only be able to help if it's something that they could do, that they could attempt by themselves in the first place, and if more than one person would actually be helpful.
Hmm.
So those are very broad and kind of general guidelines. I don't think you could give someone a help action for investigating a book, because now they're what are they? They're reading over your shoulder and they're
Hmm.
like pointing out difficult words to you or something. No, that is not a helpable action. I would also bear in mind for helping proficiency.
Hmm.
The book doesn't mention this, but I think this is a nice way to head off some of that help dogpiling or skill dogpiling. Is the book says a character can only help if they could attempt it themselves. And I'm a big believer. I was going to bring it up at some point in this episode. One of my very favorite sort of house rules or somewhat semi homebrew rules. Something I think DMs should incorporate more is you can't even attempt something if you're not proficient.
Hmm.
This task is so tedious or difficult or particular that if you're not proficient in the skill, it's Greek to you. You don't know where to even begin. So I think you could also bring that into play for help situations, because we all know um, how somebody who doesn't know what they're doing trying to help you can actually make the task harder sometimes.
Mhm.
So um, don't forget about that either. I like that as a way to reward proficiency. Is sometimes there are skill checks that if you're not proficient, you can't even attempt it. Um, or being proficient means you don't have to make a check. You just succeed.
Yeah, with
Um,
certain lower DC stuff, yeah.
yeah, my favorite example is like for stealth. If you are the stealth master, Ninja
Mhm.
Gaiden, you super spy, being stealthy from a
I got
crowd of townies and
mhm,
peasants and town guards, you don't need to roll that.
mhm,
As DM, I say you're proficient in stealth. You can hide from these guys all night.
mhm.
If you're hiding from the lieutenant of the big bad evil guy, you still have to roll that.
Yeah. The
Um,
demon with true
but
sight and dark vision up to 400 feet, and yeah, that you might
right,
have to roll
right.
for.
So I think that's a way to not only reward someone for their proficiency, but also speed up the game a little bit.
Mhm.
Anyway, I'm
I
starting to
echo.
ramble.
No, you're good. I echo a lot of your words there. The one thing I will throw out there, as far as the help is concerned, so often the help action or the help mechanic is simply boiled down to a mechanic, and it just ruins the, like, not immersion, but I guess like the feeling of a group working together or the game itself, where someone's just like, oh yeah, I give them the help action, I give them advantage. Why not take the initiative there and go, hey, before you go to start picking this lock, I know a thing or two about picking locks. I'm lock picking McGee McJunior. Like, let me sit down and like help you out here. And again, it adds to the story. It lets the characters interact. It's a natural flow of what's going on, and it doesn't just boil down to like, oh, you got advantage now. Oh, you got bless. Like, that like is something that just grinds my gears so much when the game just turns into like, oh, you got a +4 because of this. Oh, you got a +3 because of this. Oh, you got advantage on that because of this. It's like, so yeah, with help action, feel free to showcase what that is.
Yeah, well, and as DM, I think you could call for it even.
Yeah.
If it's something that's not obvious, like I
Yeah.
think
Well, how does this look? Yeah.
if someone is helping with perception, we don't really need to describe that every
Hmm.
time. But if it's something that you're kind of iffy on, ask the player, okay, how are you helping?
Hmm.
Specifically, what is your character doing that is helpful to your party mate here?
Hmm.
Um, and it will either add flavor to the game or it will help the player come to the conclusion that they can't actually be helpful without
Hmm.
you having to seem like a tyrant.
Yep. Yeah. So I think, yeah, general good advice. Again, with your table, there's a lot of, I guess, scale or spectrum here, right? Like, some players just want to roll dice every time, and that's totally fine. Some players just don't care what help looks like. That's fine. But as far as like, I guess the perfect D&D in my mind, or the best way to stimulate the creative senses, this is what I would usually recommend, or at least what I picture as a cool thing to watch or listen to or tell. So.
So there's two more little bonus topics that I have in mind to cover.
Bonus topics.
Yeah. The first is how to handle ties.
Hmm.
And I can't remember off the top of my head. Forgive me, correct me in the comments down below. Also, like and subscribe while you're there. I can't remember offhand if the player's handbook has a rules as written statement about how this works, but I know how I handle it. And that is that in the case of ties, I've seen some DMs will do roll offs. They'll roll, like if it's an opposed strength check or athletics check, and you tie, then there'll be a roll off, or they'll go with who has the higher strength bonus or what have
Hmm.
you. I think it's simpler than that. I think the game gives us the answer in other places. Uh, armor class is basically the DC for a melee attack. And if you meet the armor class, you succeed in hitting them.
Mhm.
Skill checks are the same way. If you meet the DC for a skill check, you succeed. So, in my mind, if it is an opposed skill check that is resulted in a tie, the tie goes to the aggressor. The DC of their attempt was the victim's skill check.
Yeah, I mean, I think the
So
easiest example is a player trying to deceive an NPC, the NPC then rolling insight. If they tie or beat it, then they've beat it because they are the aggressor in that situation.
it's quick, it's clean, it's simple, and it works out evenly
Hmm.
because when the players are the aggressor and the NPCs only match the number, the players win.
Hmm.
And if the NPCs are defending if the PCs are defending and the enemies match the number, they win.
Hmm.
It's very simple. So, rule of thumb, I say that in cases of ties, the tie goes to the aggressor.
I could see like the potential tension or like moment creation of having like a roll off, like another roll. Like I could see some benefit of that or sprinkling that in with certain scenarios. But I think if you do that for everything, it would get rather repetitive.
If you want to have that like weird Dragon Ball Z push
Holding
pull,
the swords back and forth, yeah.
you can do that if you want to, but yeah,
Mhm.
every time, come on.
Yeah.
Um, and the other bonus topic, and this is another one that confuses people to no end: passive checks, passive skills.
Hmm.
Um, have seen DMs complain a lot about a character who has a passive perception of like 20. And what does that mean for creatures that are trying to sneak up on the party, or what does that mean for like actually rolling perception um in case of looking for something? And I
Hmm.
think again, if you read it carefully, first it can represent something that's happening over time. This is when you use passive checks first and foremost, and it's something that I think gets forgotten about. Um, if the party has all night to search a room and absolutely comb it for its secrets, that's a great time for a passive check. In 3.5, there was a concept called taking 10 and taking 20. Passive checks replace that. The passive check is perfect for my character is just doing this for the next 2 hours. Okay, I'm the DM. I already see what your passive number is. I know what the DCs are in the room. Here's what you find. Um, and you can even be helped with a passive check. It adds 5. Um, so that it all still works pretty quickly, pretty cleanly. The other issue, a high passive perception is not an I win button.
Hmm.
The book specifies that it can be used when the DM wants to secretly determine if a character succeeds at something without rolling dice. It does not say that a passive perception overrides an active perception attempt or when an active perception roll is necessary. It's an option for the DM if they want to keep things surprising, or if they want to reward that player who has the really perceptive character. But it's not the law that nothing can hide from that especially perceptive character. Um, and there are ways that you can use that even. It could be that creatures that aren't proficient in stealth can be passively perceived, and creatures that are can't. That's a way you could do it. If you have a creature that its whole deal is that it's stealthy, screw your passive perception. You got to look for this thing. So don't. don't feel like your hands are tied by a character with a high passive skill score because it's situational. It's not an all the time thing. And if you're a player, remember, it's situational. It's not an all the time thing. You might want to remind your DM that you have this because there's a feat in particular. I think that it's Keen Mind that adds to your passive perception score. So keep that in mind and don't let that just sit on the shelf collecting dust. But passive skills are not, the word passive is deceiving. It doesn't mean that this skill is always happening in the background like a passive skill in a video game. It just means that it's there to be used in situations where it makes sense.
The things where it comes up the most, and this is like my quick fire round of like, here is the solution to your problems. Oh, it ruins all my traps. Monsters can no longer stealth behind me, and so on and so forth and whatever. Easiest thing ever is whenever they have a disadvantage on that skill for whatever reason. They're exhausted, they're in dim light, they don't have dark vision, whatever. There's so many things that can impose disadvantage on a party for whatever reason. Or if the monster that is rolling has advantage. There's tons of different ways to balance this out, and if a passive score has disadvantage, it's -5, just as if it had a +5 for having advantage. The thing about traps and passive perception, as far as I'm aware and the best way I've always conceived it in my mind, is perception allows you to see what the trigger is, whatever that may be. That may appear as a slightly dislodged stone, or a really thin fishing line, or a lever on a wall. It isn't you see a trap that is a lever on the wall, or you see a trap that is a pit trap activated by this. All you give them for perception is I have perceived whatever the mechanism is, and you don't describe it as you have spotted a trap. It is you have perceived this, and the player might go, oh, I pull the lever, and then they get shot full of arrows. Like, it is, I think DMs have this mindset of, oh, when I am actively looking for a trap, when I do a roll for a trap, you reveal to the party or the player that they have discovered this thing, because it's I choose to do this and focus my energy on it, and I get the result. When it's a passive thing, it's not that same rule of you've discovered all these traps, you've discovered all of these issues, you just have now perceived something that might be something, and that could lead to any outcome you want. It does not completely eliminate traps altogether.
There's a concept that's been discussed by other prominent figures in the D&D community about failing forward as a way to keep a character from meeting a untimely, ridiculous death, or to avoid a lot of frustration. And this goes back to that example of I'm trying to walk across the tightrope. I failed. Now I've got to make a deck save to hang on. And if you fail that, there might be another save of some kind to fall in the correct way so that you don't take as much damage. Who knows? But these sort of nesting saves, or these nesting sort of fail states. And I like what you're saying about this. It could also be interesting to succeed incrementally. Every challenge does not have to boil down to one roll. It could be interesting, and it can build suspense if you see that a stone is a different color from all the others in the floor. And, oh, well, what is that? Well, now you're poking at it, and on and on and on. So you can fail and succeed incrementally. And as DM, it's your job to determine what is going to serve that moment. And don't be afraid to use all the tools in the toolbox. Don't forget what tools you have in the toolbox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and also one thing to kind of tag on here, it's specifically more for the trap thing, is high-level players, a high-level party, they're gonna find your traps, and that is now the point of your traps. Like, I feel like that's a hard pill to swallow, but unless some, like, archdemon from the 9th level of hell is building the specific legendary trap, these players are going to spot a line across the floor or a pitfall trap, and that's fine. They now serve their purpose of showcasing the character's abilities, improving, and you have achieved victory. You don't have to deal the 1d6 damage. You can go home happy.
it makes them feel good, and now you can feel good.
Mhm.
So, anything else that we want to say about skill checks before we close?
I think that about gets it for me. I mean, obviously, you could probably get more into the details of these things or chase a specific topic down a bit more. But I think this is a good kind of broad splattering across the spectrum.
Oh, I've got one more thing. TM. Ting. One more thing. Don't forget about tool proficiencies.
Mhm.
So many backgrounds give these, and then they never ever come up. Your player will feel so warm and fuzzy if you find that on their sheet and pick it out and use it.
Mhm.
Uh,
I think
how
thieves'
how
tools are the only one that are used all the time.
how cool would it be for your party to be exploring the bad guy's castle, and you remember that Barley Breath the dwarf is proficient in masonry tools, and you tell him, due to your passive masonry tools score,
Proficiency, yeah.
yeah, you realize that this wall is the load bearing wall. Uh-oh. Now they're excited.
Mhm.
Uh yeah, don't forget about those. There's
Mhm.
a ton of tool proficiencies, and the other one is like musical instrument for bards.
I
That
don't
comes in
think
a lot.
people, yeah, fail to use
Yeah.
that one.
But it's more than just musical instruments and thieves' tools.
Mhm.
Work those in. It'll be fun. Just try it. That's all that I've got. This has been a. I am very pleased with the depth that we've achieved on this discussion of skills.
Well, I think there's
So
just so much like acceptance of things being kind of murky and gray and not worth like chasing down with skills because it there's so many reasons like trying to speed up play or trying to not cause problems or just not knowing things or not wanting to like really dig into it. There's a lot of depth in the skill system because it's a large part of the game, and if you don't pay attention to it, you're missing out on quite a bit.
it definitely. You're missing out on a lot. You're missing out on opportunities to reward players with those moments that make them feel like their character decisions paid off.
Hmm.
So hopefully you have heard something that made you think or that will improve your game. And there again, no joke. Like, comment, subscribe. Love to see it. Helps the channel to grow. It gives us giddy feelings when we see that.
Gives us an inspiration die.
Yeah. And as you know, those go away every time we go to bed.
Oh
So we
Jesus.
we need another one every day.
No.
Really.
But yeah, I think that about sums it up. And hopefully we added to the conversation.
So don't forget to take the 1D&D playtest survey,
Mhm.
and don't forget to come back for the next episode.
Until next time.